Hello, I'm going to give you 3 examples of British military deception. One from World War I and 2 from World War II in this video, which has been sponsored by Audible, but more of that later. Now, the first of these comes from the Dardanelles. You've probably heard of the Gallipoli campaign, and you've probably also heard that it did not go well, not for the Allies. A very large expeditionary force of British, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians and French landed and failed to make headway inland. The high ground was held by the Turks. Now, I've been there, and it's horrendous to me to think that people had to fight in that terrain. It's a defender's dream and an attacker's nightmare. And they didn't get anywhere. 114,000 men were sitting on a beach, going nowhere, doing nothing of any useful military purpose when Sir Charles Munro turned up to inspect things. Now, at this stage, 57,000 of the Allies had been killed, almost exactly the same number of Turks at the same time. About double that number had been wounded so badly they could no longer fight, and about the same number again had to be evacuated because they had typhoid or dysentery or frostbite. When the snows came, people were freezing in the trenches. When the snows melted, people were drowning in the trenches and bunkers. The conditions were horrendous, and he had a very, very difficult and unenviable decision to make. Should the Allies just cut their losses and leave? At least they'd be able to get an army somewhere else where it could possibly serve some useful purpose. Or was there a reasonable chance that without too many more casualties, they could break through the Turkish lines and achieve something? Well, he decided that it was better to cut the losses. He knew he wasn't going to make himself popular, but he reported back to London that in his estimation, the chances of making any headway were too low, and about 30 to 40% of the army would be lost during the evacuation. The Turks would see what was going on, would surge forward, kill lots of men and capture far more. 30 to 40% was his estimate. I read one estimate that went as high as 50%. You're trying to pull an army out from an inferior position right under the noses of 60,000 Turks commanding the heights. Can't be done, right? Well, a new commander, Sir William Birdswood, came in, and it fell to him to organise the withdrawal. Now, he had 114,000 men sitting on a beach doing nothing, but if he just pulled them out, then the Turks would presumably work out what was going on, and they would make their way forwards. Now, they only had to get a few yards forwards in places to be in the Allied positions. If they got as much as 300 yards forward, they would have such a commanding view over everything that they would be able to see everything that was going on, and there was no way they could be fooled. So they had to be kept in their current positions. They couldn't be allowed to advance at all. How is this possible? Well, he decided that the main policy would be business as usual. Everything today must look as though it were just like yesterday. So yesterday, ships came in, and lots of mules came off the ships carrying lots and lots of supplies, and men were stacking up crates full of supplies and food and ammunition and so forth on the beach, and men were loitering around in the back, and the trenches at the front were full of men, and the barbed wire was kept well in good repair. So that's what he needed the enemy to see. Everything today was just like yesterday. In fact, of course, those mules were the same mules going round and round, and their panniers were either empty or just full of sawdust or something just to look the part. And those crates being stacked up on the beaches were just full of sand. The Allies weren't actually landing any new supplies, and by night they were getting supplies and men out, slowly denuding all the various trenches. Now, you can imagine, can't you, that one of the problems is that as there are fewer and fewer men in the trenches, during the day there'll be less and less noise. So wouldn't the Turks after a while just think it's so quiet they'd launch an attack, just an exploratory attack somewhere, and if they found one completely empty trench and then another, there could be a domino effect, and it could turn into a catastrophe. So long in advance of the actual evacuation, they adopted another policy at the front line. In just places, not everywhere, but just in places, they would order absolute silence from these trenches in this area. In those trenches would be men stocked up with lots of ammunition, waiting in absolute silence. Now, when the Turks did launch an attack, the order was a hail of withering fire. It doesn't matter if you actually hit many people, you just have to see them off and just fire. You've got loads of ammunition. We've got so few men now that the ammunition, you can have as much ammunition as you like. Just fire and fire, a hail of withering fire. So what the idea was that it would teach the Turks that silence was actually a trap. It was a lure to get you to advance, and then the result would be a load of withering fire. So the Turks, after a while, learned, okay, so silence is actually a lure. So if we come across silence, right, we won't fall for it next time. And they didn't, which meant that therefore they did. Because of course, after a while, a lot of the frontline trenches really had no one in them. The artillery pieces were being taken away and replaced with dummy artillery pieces, and the fewer and fewer artillery pieces that were real that were still left had to fire more and more shells, and the artillerymen had to work harder and harder to keep up the pretense that there were still sizable artillery batteries at work. One clever invention was a way of jamming a rifle into the parapet of a trench, aiming it at something reasonably convincing, and then setting up two cans. The top can has water in it and a tiny hole that drips into a lower can, which gradually gets heavier, and a string attached to that lower can eventually pulls the trigger on the rifle and fires the shot, long after that trench has actually been abandoned. So it was a way of coming out of a trench and giving yourself a few more hours of apparently still being there and fooling the enemy. Snipers, of course, still sniped. You don't need very many people to be snipers to convince the enemy that they're still being watched and that everything is still being maintained. A constant nuisance to the enemy, a constant reminder that that enemy can't be too complacent. So they removed the duck boards as well from the bottom of the trenches so that men could sneak out of the trenches more quietly. Another thing they did was leave behind booby traps, wire with grenades and the like, and officers would be the last to leave and would leave the booby traps. A little bit dastardly, you might say. Mines were also dug under the Turkish position. One particularly large mine was exploded just before the last evacuation and is said to have killed as many as 70 Turks. But these large mining works with huge explosions were usually the prelude to an attack. So as soon as that goes up, the Turks then think, oh, right, we've got to busy ourselves repairing these defences now before the inevitable attack comes on us. So that it's another way of delaying the Turks from going forward. So they managed to get onto the ships and get away and suffer, astoundingly, no losses. The Gallipoli evacuation, at least from the army, I have read of one sailor who died in an accident during the evacuation, but otherwise they got away with no losses, not the tens of thousands of losses that were predicted. So that was a very successful piece of military deception. Now, fast forwarding to World War II, I'm going to talk about Operation Bertram. Operation Bertram was the operation to fool Rommel and the Afrika Korps into thinking that the Second Battle of El Alamein would be a thrust by Montgomery and his desert rats in the south, not in the north. Now, the front went from the sea to the Katara Depression. It was only about 30 miles long, and both sides were convinced that you couldn't take an army through the Katara Depression. It was surrounded by cliffs, and it was full of soft sand and marsh. Some of the long-range Desert Patrol Group went in there with their jeeps, but the idea of taking a whole army through the Katara Depression, both sides were agreed that's not going to happen. Oh, there's a little aside. There was one radio operator, a German, who was stationed in the Katara Depression, presumably just keeping an eye out just in case the British did try to take an army through there, because you never know, they might. And every day he would say, "Nothing to report." Nothing to report. He would report in the Enigma cipher, which was extremely useful because every day the settings for Enigma would be changed, and the code breakers at Bletchley Park were trying to work out today's settings. And if they got a message with that number of characters from him, I bet it's nothing to report. We've translated this, we've decoded this several times in the past, and it's always been nothing to report. Same number of characters. Okay, let's assume this says nothing to report. From this we can calculate today's settings. Thank you. Anyway, so a bit of an aside there. So yes, you've got North Africa, you've got the coast, and you've got the Katara Depression, 30 miles in between. So what's actually going to happen is there's going to be a huge attack in the north, close to the coast, where you would sort of expect the attack to be, really, because the further you are from the coast, the greater your logistics problems are. So, how can we fool the Germans into thinking that we're actually going to attack in the south and not the north? Not easy, because this is desert warfare, and it's very difficult to hide an army because, well, how do you... They found quite early on that when they took their European camouflage nets, oh, let's just disguise this thing as a bush. Look, you throw this over it, looks like a bush. Yet that works in Europe. If you fly over a bit of Europe in a plane and look down and you see a bush, well, there's a bush there and the bush there and the bush there and the bush, and all that's hedges. Any of those bushes could be a tank, but it probably isn't. It's probably just a bush. But if you're flying over a load of flat desert and you see a bush, well, that's probably a tank or something. It doesn't work. They found actually camouflage nets tended to attract attention rather than act as useful camouflage. And even if you've painted a tank, say, to look absolutely perfectly the same colour as the ground around it, it throws a shadow, a really harsh shadow. When you're flying over the top in a reconnaissance plane and you look down, your irises are closed tight because the bright sun is bouncing off the desert and shadows look really dark. And so if anything sticks up at all, it's just given away. And you can't hide hundreds and hundreds of tanks and thousands of lorries in a desert. So that was a problem, but it was also an opportunity because, of course, both sides knew that you couldn't hide an army, not in the desert. So what if we show them an army that they're expecting to see, but it's not actually the army that is really there? Right. What if we park a long way from the front line, back there all our tanks, and much closer to the front line, loads of lorries? The enemy will know that any large offensive is going to involve the tanks. But if they're 2 days behind the front line, the enemy will also know that the attack can't be happening for at least another 2 days. So we can't possibly surprise them, but we want to surprise them. Okay, so we'll let the enemy see all those tanks. Reconnaissance planes will come over, see the tanks and fly off again, and they'll see all the lorries. And we let them see that day after day. And then we use sunscreens, sun shields and cannibals and swap everything around. So what was a sun shield? A sun shield was actually first proposed by Wavell, the commander himself. Could we disguise a tank to look like a lorry? You could put a big screen over the top of it, and from the air, maybe it would look like a lorry. So they tried this, and they produced the Mark I sunscreen, which was made of wood, and it took 12 men to lift, and they thought this is not going to work. But then the Mark II, much better. Thin tubular steel with calico cloth stretched over the top and then painted to look quite convincingly like a lorry. And they experimented. They flew aircraft over the top and told people, right, tell us which one's the lorry and which one's the tank. And they found that even at 500 feet, even when the observers knew that one of them wasn't actually a lorry, they couldn't tell which one was the tank. So they had a camouflage wheeze that actually worked. Thing is that they were going to need an awful lot of these. They were going to need about 722, in fact, of these sun shields. So they had to get a load of people to make them. And they got 3 companies of pioneers, one from the Seychelles, one from East Africa, and one from Mauritius. And one would weave local materials, palm fronds and so forth, into the frame, and another lot would cover it in cheap calico, and another lot would then paint on the wheels and the details to make it look more convincing from the air. And they employed architects and set decorators from the theatre and film industries to enhance the effect. Interestingly, these 3 units of pioneers, they couldn't all be put together because they hated each other so much. They had to be given 3 separate camps and their own canteens as well, so they wouldn't wander off to eat somewhere else and get gossipy and let out all the secrets. So all these sun shields were made to disguise tanks as lorries. They then had to make another load of disguises to make lorries look like tanks. Some of them they wanted to be able to move, so they built big frameworks on tops of jeeps and so forth, so that the enemy might see a tank moving around. It's more convincingly a tank. But how do you get supplies? Oh, well, okay, right. You get supplies to the front by building out of boxes the likenesses of more lorries, and then you put perhaps a cloth over the top and paint it and make it look convincingly like a lorry. Of course, there was a bit of a problem there, because if it's not in a guarded camp, what if the locals or some indisciplined troops decide to just nick a load of the supplies. Well, that was a problem, and so thinking of that, they put all the nice stuff, all the sugar, all the popular stuff that would have been nicked straight away in the middle, and all the boring but necessary stuff around the outside. So you'd have to spend a very long time unpiling these very large stacks to get to the good stuff in the middle. But also they just accepted that they were going to lose some of the food. Some of it was just going to get nicked, but they took that into account. Oh, but wait a minute, we'll also need fuel at the front. How do we get the fuel to the front? Okay, well we could try a pipeline, but they'll see that. We could try big tankers that could move, and that's dangerous. They just decided that they were going to do it in just 4-gallon cans. Yep. You can't hide much in the desert. It's very difficult, for instance, if you've dug trenches, to hide the trenches because the shadow cast by the lip onto the floor of the trench, no matter what colour the ground is such a harsh shadow that you can see trenches from aircraft. But those harsh, dark shadows in the desert are also very handy for hiding stuff in, because, again, when you look down onto the expanse of desert from an aircraft, your iris is shut right down, so the shadows look really, really dark. And if hidden all the way along one side of the trench is a great row of cans, they won't see it. And again, they experimented and find, no, you really can't see. These cans just disappear into the shadows. And if the sun moves over there, well, you just move all the cans across, and they remain invisible. And the British managed to hide 2,000 tons of fuel right at the front in trenches. So okay, you've got your fuel forward, you've got your food forward. Right, so how do you get your tanks forward? Well, 2 nights before the actual attack, they drove at night all the tanks to where the lorries were, and all the lorries back to where the tanks were, and disguised all the tanks as lorries and all the lorries as tanks. A German reconnaissance plane would quickly go over the top and just confirm that, yep, everything's as it was. Don't forget that the Allies have air superiority at this point, so the German reconnaissance planes aren't going to linger and go around and, are you sure that's a tank? Let's go down for another look, because I just think that for no particular reason that might be a Jeep disguised as a tank with a big frame on it, just painted, and they weren't given the leisure to do that. And on the last day, the RAF excluded all German reconnaissance planes. Okay, you've seen enough now, thanks. So, hidden as lorries, all the British tanks were now in position, in the forward position, ready for the attack in the north. Of course, you have to convince them not just that you're not attacking in the north, but that you are attacking in the south. So you have to build up loads of supplies in the south. But of course, that's a horrendous logistical nightmare. So what they did is they just came up with frames with, again, cloth over them, painted to look like stacks of supplies, and they built about 700 of these. There was a bit of a hairy moment when, after a windstorm, a lot of the tent-like things got blown somewhat ragged, and they spent a frantic day trying to peg everything back down again. But fortunately, the enemy hadn't noticed. I imagine that they probably had the same windstorm to deal with. So they got supplies in the south, and another thing, a pipeline, not a real pipeline, but a fake pipeline. This had 2 very useful purposes. Not only did it disguise where the attack was coming, but also when. They started building the pipeline from the north down towards the south at about 5 miles a day, quite steady progress. It wasn't a real pipeline, it was just fake. It just, from the air, looked good. But they went to a lot of trouble. They put pumping stations and overhead pressure tanks and filling stations, and they had traffic driving up and down it just to put loads of tracks in the sand and make it look busy. But it wasn't down to the south yet. So obviously the attack's not going to go ahead before they finished the pipeline to supply this attack with water. So that gave the Germans a number of days grace. The attack can't be happening now. The pipeline's not been finished. So it suggests that it's going to be in the south, and it also suggests it's not going to be in the south for a while yet. But there was actually another problem that the Allies had. You see, if you want the Germans to believe that you're going to attack in the south, then you have to do everything that's consistent with an attack in the south. Now, what would the British do if they were actually attacking in the south? They'd try to fool the Germans into thinking that they're not attacking in the south. So there was a deception plan within the deception plan. You had to be convincing, you had to come up with a deception plan that you're not doing the thing that actually you are not doing. But it's like poker. In poker, you want one of the opposing players to see you bluffing. You want to be caught bluffing, because then if you are caught bluffing in poker, people go, ah, sometimes he bluffs. Right, and I observed him when he was bluffing, he did this, that and the other. Okay, so that later when you've got a genuinely good hand, they may bet really high stakes against you and then you win big. So they had to come up with a deception plan in the south that deliberately failed. So what they did is they created 3.5 regiments of dummy artillery, and they put them where the enemy could see them. And at first, these were very convincing. They really did look like artillery, and the enemy kept a safe distance accordingly. But every day they maintained these dummies a little less well. If some of the sand had been blown off, something exposing a part of the subterfuge, they wouldn't shovel the sand back on. If a net had been blown off here, they would just leave it, and perhaps some cannon would be moved and the enemy would get a slightly better look at it from a different angle, and hang on, those are dummies. And the Germans, they go, ah, so Tommy thinks he can fool us, huh? Ah. And the Germans predictably did what Germans do, the spoiler attack. This was a very common German tactic, and Rommel was a fan of it. If you see the enemy massing for an attack somewhere, you don't wait for him to attack you at a time of his choosing and when he's completely ready. You launch a spoiler attack. You get in there first, and you may not have the resources to follow up and actually do much, but you just spoil that attack and break up his formations, cause some casualties, cause chaos, and get out of there. A spoiler attack. And that's what they did. They launched a spoiler attack in the south. The thing is, though, that knowing that this was going to happen, or at least predicting that it was going to happen, the British had replaced their 3.5 regiments of dummy guns with real guns, and then they just shelled the hell out of the attack. And so the Germans go, oh right, yeah, okay, yeah, right, so it was a deception plan, so they are attacking in the south, which they weren't. The British attacked in the north, and the British achieved absolute surprise. In fact, Rommel was so confident that the British weren't going to be attacking anytime soon, he'd gone back to Germany. The Germans had no idea that the attack was going to happen when it happened, and they were, in fact, their estimates, it later became known, their estimates were that the attack wasn't going to happen for several weeks. They were convinced that it was going to happen in the south. They were also convinced that they were up against much greater opposition than they were against. So there you go. If you disguise lorries as tanks and tanks as lorries, if you show the enemy what he expects to see, then he'll interpret it as that over and over again, and you can fool him, even in the desert where everything is sort of in plain view. Now, I suppose I should say something about my sponsors, Audible. Now, Audible, in case you don't know, is a very large online website which stocks lots and lots of audiobooks, an unparalleled and unrivaled collection of audiobooks. And if you were to go to, say, www.audible.com/LindyBeige, that's www.audible.com/LindyBeige, you will be able to find an offer of a free 30-day trial, and during that you get 30% off all of the various audiobooks that you might want to buy, plus one free book to keep forever. It's yours, and you could even share it with a friend. Now, you can listen in the car, on the beach, and there are all sorts of devices, telephones and tablets and devices. You know, you young folk, you have devices, and you can listen to stuff on your devices, and well done to you. And you can alter the speed as well. If you think that someone's narrating a little bit too slowly, you can speed him up a bit without turning him into a Smurf. The voice doesn't go up in pitch to a laughable degree. Another thing you can do is you can text LindyBeige to 500 500. That's LindyBeige to 500 500, and you get the same offer. And one book that, if you're the sort of person who likes this video, you might very likely be the sort of person who would like this book, is called A Force. No, it's not called A Force, it's called A Force. A Force is the story of British deception during the Second World War. And A Force was the unit that was formed by one Colonel Dudley Clark. Now, Dudley Clark was the mastermind behind Operation Bertram. He is credited with lots of things. For instance, he's credited with the formation of the Commandos and the SAS and the US Rangers. It's a bit of an exaggeration. For an example, yes, he did create the SAS, sort of. The SAS didn't actually exist in real, actual troops. Instead, he created a fake ghost regiment of parachutists, because he wanted the enemy to be fearing loads of British paratroopers landing to the rear all the time, so they'd have to station all sorts of forces back there away from the front line just in case British paratroopers of this SAS regiment lands. In fact, the SAS didn't exist. It was a phantom unit that he made up. Later, of course, it turned into a real unit. So did that mean that he founded the SAS or didn't he? I don't know. You could argue both ways. But anyway, Dudley Clarke and his various deception plans during the war. Now, one, you could say, good thing about Dudley Clarke is that he was meant to keep all his secrets secret, and he obeyed the rules, rules that were flouted by lots of other people who wrote their memoirs and gave away all sorts of secrets. But he didn't write memoirs, and at least not of his military deception plans. So it's sort of a shame that we don't have his first-hand account of all the stuff he did, but on the other hand, it's sort of admirable as well that, you know, he played the game and didn't profit by his privileged position. Right, so there you go. That was a book that I think you do well to listen to if you're into this sort of thing, and you can get it for free if you go to www.audible.com/Lindybeige. Now, the third of these three operations I want to talk to you about is Camilla. And Camilla is actually the inspiration for this entire video and the one I did before it, because one of my viewers told me about Camilla, and I just thought it was such a good story that I needed to tell it in a video. Now, this is a deception plan that was done 1 year before by Dudley Clarke, so it's 1940, that was 100% successful. He got the enemy to think exactly what he wanted the enemy to think. But despite its being 100% successful, it was a catastrophic failure. You might think, well, how can it be successful and a failure? Well, listen on. Now, there was a place in Africa called British Somaliland. You've forgotten where British Somaliland was? Tut tut. British Somaliland, about there, you see. So bordering on the Red Sea, just across from what is today Yemen, but was in those days Aden, which was also a British territory. Now, you can imagine that when the Italians took over British Somaliland, they might expect the British to think, I say, that's not on, and try to take it back from them. So it was an obvious target, a very obvious, believable target for the British to attack. And one pretty obvious way of doing it would be an amphibious assault from the north, going across the sea using the Royal Navy, which is still very, very powerful, and shipped in troops from perhaps Kenya or the Sudan or India. There are loads of places they could get to Aden by sea quite easily, and then go across the water to take out, well, to liberate, if you like, or recolonize, depending on how you look at it, British Somalia. Now, the Italians had a big garrison in British Somalia and another big garrison in Eritrea. Sorry, I'll do it from your way around, so it's more like there. There we go. But actually, the plan wasn't to attack British Somaliland from the north. Instead, they were going to attack overland from the northwest and attack Eritrea. So the plan was to convince the Italians that the attack was actually going to be on Somaliland from the north, but actually it was going to go across land to Eritrea. So you've got two basic areas here. Which one are the British going to attack? It's going to be British Somaliland. We want them to think. So how do we do this? How do we convince them? Well, first, Dudley Clarke organised a lot of air raids and sea raids against exactly the sort of targets on the north coast of British Somaliland that the enemy would expect to be softened up in advance of an amphibious landing. Another thing he did was organise completely fake HQs. He set up an HQ, a very large HQ in Aden, which actually was in command of nothing, but he just wanted to create an awful lot of radio traffic and telegrams and messages going back and forth. And he set up HQs in South Africa, in Kenya, in India, and in Cairo, and the huge amount of radio traffic going back and forth. A lot of it was in code, of course, but even if the enemy can't decode it, the sheer amount of radio traffic from those particular places was a very strong indicator that the attack was going to come from Aden against British Somaliland. But of course it wasn't all in the best of code. Some of it might have been, you know, slightly sloppily coded. I don't know how that happened. And to add to this, they would deliberately furnish rumours to people they knew were passing on information to the enemy. They knew, for instance, that the Japanese consulate in Port Said was passing on stuff to the enemy, so they planted a load of false information on him, and dutifully he did in fact pass that on to the enemy. Thanks. And a lot of whispers in the Kasbahs. Do they have Kasbahs in Cairo? Well, I'm going to say that they did, and in that sort of place, so that, again, the various agents working for the enemy amongst the locals would pass it on. He also got a very large number of pamphlets and maps printed and distributed to all the troops, and these were maps of British Somaliland, how to get on with British Somalis, the climate and geography of British Somaliland, some useful phrases for people going to British Somaliland. And of course, with all the troops being issued all this sort of stuff, word would get around again. Some of those pamphlets might go astray and be found by, oh, I don't know, people who might be passing on information to the enemy. And it painted a picture. British Somaliland was the target. Now, you can imagine that he would think that if he'd fooled the enemy into thinking what he wanted the enemy to think, then his job was done. That was the job he was given, and he was completely successful. The Italians swallowed it absolutely, hook, line and sinker. They looked at these private telegrams that got intercepted with just subtle indiscretions in them, just in plain text. These were just, you know, private telegrams, but just someone saying it'll be lovely to see our old house again in, that sounds like a British Somaliland place name. Why would you be saying that? Ah, little indiscretions like that fell into the hands of the enemy by some means, and that's it. The job was done. He had fooled them. He'd got them to believe the wrong target. So, why was it a failure? It was a failure because what the Italians did was think to themselves, oh, looks like the British are going to attack British Somaliland. So, let's pull out of British Somaliland and put all our troops into Eritrea instead. The actual target of the actual attack. So when the British attacked Eritrea, rather than, as was the expectation in the success of the Operation Camilla, that they would denude Eritrea and put their forces into British Somaliland, since they knew this attack was going to be coming across from Aden, they ended up fighting double the number of defenders that they actually had been expecting. So it was brilliantly successful and an utter failure. It had exactly the opposite effect from the effect intended. And Dudley Clarke learnt a big lesson, and he wrote of this. He said that he thought that his job was to make the enemy think what he wanted them to think, but actually he realised, no, it's to get the enemy to do what you want him to do. If the British had learned that British Somaliland was going to be attacked, the British would have reinforced British Somaliland, because that's how they operated. But the Italians did exactly the opposite and got out of there. Now, Wavell, who was in command of the British fighting the Italians at this stage in the war, put his faith in Dudley Clarke, and he what? Now, people remember Wavell as the general who got beaten by the Desert Fox, by Rommel, and then got replaced. And yes, he was. He did lose a battle to the Desert Fox, and he was replaced. But a lot of people, that seems to be the only thing they remember about him, which I think is very unfair, because he was, prior to that defeat against Rommel, he was a very successful and innovative general. Here, he beat the Italians. Now, the Italian Empire in Africa was not small. Look, see, that was the Italian Empire at its height. Even the magenta bits, they didn't have the magenta bits for very long, but, you know, at its height, it was a big, big area. And Wavell had, at the start of operations, 50,000 men at his disposal. 50,000 men, that may sound like quite a lot. He was up against 750,000. He was outnumbered 15 to 1. Anyway, the British did go into Eritrea, and they won anyway, and the Italians surrendered. But in terms of a deception plan, oops.